his past roles as well as his role here at the Episcopal Church Foundation, and then we can get rolling with our webinar. So Jerry, take it away.
Well, I'm Jerry Kuchar. This year is I'll celebrate the 20th year of my ordination to the diaconate and the priesthood. I've served in the Diocese of New York and Long Island. For a long time I was on the diocesan staff in New York, was the finance officer, the controller, and then I went to the Church of the Intercession in Upper Manhattan, and now I'm serving at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Brooklyn in the Diocese of Long Island. I've written a couple of books about church leadership and finance. Some of you may have come across them. Remember the Future, Financial Leadership for Congregations. Humble and Strong, Mutually Accountable Leadership in the Church. I thought I'd write about something I hadn't experienced a lot of. And most recently, Back from the Dead, the book of congregational growth about my experiences with helping to turn around parishes that are really on the brink of failure. So it's
Jerry,
great to have you.
Jerry, can you bring your phone a little bit closer? It's getting a little too far away. That's much better.
Let me. How about this?
That's perfect. Go right ahead. Thank you, Jerry.
So it was nice to see some of your faces a little bit before. One of the things that the things I find a little constraining about these web conferences is the only person I'm actually looking at is myself. So I do want to make it as interactive as possible. So if a question comes up or a related matter, please type it in so that Jim can monitor it and we can talk about it as we can. And I'd be very happy. You can get the presentation when we're done. You can download it all. And I'll be very happy to follow up with anybody that would like to know anything or to talk about anything else. Whoa.
Sorry, Jerry, you're all set.
Did you?
Go ahead.
All right. I want to say that, I have a very high view of leadership and a very particular view about what leadership really is, which is not at all, hierarchical or something, but I've never known a parish without an effective leader that thrived. So, and one of the most important functions of leadership is dealing with the financial situation and getting the financial situation, whatever shape it's in, healthier so that you pass on something better for your successors. Because leadership, the legacy of leadership is a future for the organization that you're leading. It doesn't really have to do with the wonderful things that you did or your preaching style or any other thing. It has to do with, is the parish better off when you leave than it was when you came by every possible metric, both for clergy and lay leaders. And I also think that good administration and transparent finances that people don't have any suspicions or questions about are themselves good ministry. Just a word about the different ways that people support the ministry of the church. There's ordinary or annual giving, which is the giving that you solicit every year through your pledge campaign. And it's annual giving because funds are solicited usually once a year, although they give, you want people to give all through the year, and you use it for your annual budget, the annual regular recurring expenses of the church. Extraordinary giving is most usually a capital campaign, a major effort to raise a multiple of your pledge base for a particular need, to build something, to renovate something that's already built, to create an endowment, or sometimes to retire debt. And then ultimate or planned giving is the gifts that you decide to make through your estate. So it's a planned gift because you've made the decision years before the gift is actually made. And what I hope everybody does with any bequest of any size or any planned gift that you receive is to treat it with the respect it deserves, not to spend it, not to put it in the annual budget and use it to plug a budget deficit, but to add it to your long-term invested funds and to use it, I hope, for the either for the maintenance of the buildings so that the buildings that people love through their lives can continue to minister to other people for generations to come. Now, why should parish leaders care about these things? Because healthy finances, first of all, enable ministry now. And they say something about the parish's future. If you have a leader that comes in, whether it's a lay leader or a cleric, that has a particular passion and wants to spend all the money on something right now, what you're basically saying is that what I want is more important than what people in the future might want. And I think that's not the kind of selfless leadership that actually builds up the church. And that healthy finances impact what present and future leaders are able to do. So leadership is about the future. Leadership is about creating a better future for your congregation. So what is a healthy financial operation? And here's my definition, that a healthy financial operation involves at least these four things. That the expense side of the budget provides for sufficient staff and the resources for a thriving operation. The words sufficient and thriving are important here because almost all budgets provide for staff, and they provide some level of staff, and they provide for some kind of operation like paying the light bill or something. But I want to say it's been a long time since a lot of our parishes have thought about what do we really need? What kind of staffing, what kind of operation do we need really to be carrying out the ministry rather than just to be, changing the buckets under the leaking roof or just keeping things going for another week or another month. And that on the income side, sufficient streams of revenue have been identified to fund that level of staff and resources, and the budget is realistically balanced. Now, so I'm talking about, for most of us, I'm talking about a budget. If you thought about your parish budget, and no doubt the difficulty that you have making it come to balance, and the things that you've cut out over the last 15 or 20 years, can you really be a thriving operation at the level that you're funded? Or do you need more staff, more resources to do the work that you believe God is calling you to do? Now, this one I want to spend just a tiny little bit of time on because if in a healthy financial operation, you've got a budget that will allow you to thrive, and you've got it balanced, and in that budget that allows you to thrive, 75% or more of the income comes from individual contributions rather than from other sources of operating income like space use fees or fundraising events or from your endowment, your long-term investments. Now, many of you will say, well, we must have a healthy organization because our $75,000 budget is $65,000 funded by individual contributions. Well, but is that $75,000 budget, does it really allow you to thrive? Is it really sufficient for what you need to do? Or does it just provide for a supply priest? This is where I feel like some of the things that I'm saying are maybe different from what you've heard. And, I don't ever mean to overwhelm or to criticize people, but I do mean to challenge some of the places where we've been for a very long time, particularly considering the decline of the church in general over the last 40 years. We've become so used to managing decline that we're not always able to raise our sights and to think, well, what would it be like if it were better? And how could we become better? So you may be at 75% of your budget funded with individual contributions, but I don't think that necessarily means that you're, that's a healthy indicator if your budget is too small. Do you understand what I mean? And finally, you're funding a capital reserve outside the operating budget. You have identified some revenue source that can go into a reserve fund so that you don't have to defer maintenance on your buildings, and you can keep them up you can replace things that wear out, and you can keep the fabric that you have in good shape. And then capital campaigns become very exciting opportunities, not to fix a broken roof, but to either build a new wing to the building, or update it for new needs, or renovate it for different purposes or something, a real future-oriented capital campaign. So you've got enough staff and resources for a thriving operation. You've got sufficient revenue to cover it. Of that sufficient revenue, 75% is coming from individual contributions, and you're funding a capital reserve. Now, this may seem, we'll get to in a minute, to how to deal with a little more of how to deal with the gap between where we are and where we would like to be. And there are a couple of ways. First of all, that we try to hide the reality of the situation from ourselves so that we don't have to deal with it. One way is by adopting an unbalanced budget. In one little parish where I was the seminarian, I guess somebody from the diocesan office told them they had to have a budget. So they identified, they had a budget that had the $29,000 in income that they were actually going to get, and the expense side was $91,000. And I knew that that was wrong, but I was too inexperienced to know exactly how to address it. But every year they raised the $29,000 that they had, and that's what they spent. So an unbalanced budget is one way of saying you want to do something, but then you know you're not going to be able to do it because you can't pay for it if somebody did try to spend that money. Another great way that we do this is to either not talk about financial realities, or to say that talking about financial realities is a sign of faithlessness. And if we had more faith, we just go ahead and, I don't know, keep doing what we're doing and keep declining and stuff like that. I think it makes sense to address the realities of a financial situation, not with the idea of shutting down the discussion or making people feel bad, but so that, because I think God meets us in reality. And if we try to shut our eyes to what the reality of it is, we're also shutting our eyes to maybe the opportunities that God has put in that real situation. So don't ever tell any, there are negative ways of talking about money, and there are positive ways of talking about money, but don't ever shut down a discussion, don't ever shut down a constructive discussion of the financial realities of your situation. A very common way of hiding the reality of the situation is by the treasurer of the finance committee failing to provide the vestry with complete, concise reports with the necessary information. If you give people no report, or you give people a 6-page report, or you report only on the previous month, it's, in a way, it's almost like giving them no information, because it's undigestible and it doesn't answer the questions that need to be answered in a financial report.
Gary, on a point you made on a previous slide, can you suggest any guidelines for how much should be in a replacement capital reserve, either a percentage of budget or otherwise?
Yes. The quickest way to do it is to look at your insurance policy and see what, I hope you have replacement value insurance, not actual cash value insurance. In other words, your insurance, if you had a loss, your insurance company will replace what was lost. And so it's going to be a big number. So you look at the insurance policy and you see what your carrier, I hope it's Church Insurance, I hope that they're providing good service to you, has estimated as the cost of replacing your plant. It's going to be a number in the millions of dollars for almost any building of any kind of size. You multiply that number by 2.5%, with the idea being that everything is on a 40-year replacement cycle. Some things have to be replaced more often, some things last longer, but a lot of the expensive things have to be replaced more often. So what building professionals use as a rule of thumb is 2.5%. This means that if you have a $2 million plant, which is a fairly modest plant, it's not a very big, including the rectory and everything, that means you should be setting aside $50,000 a year in a capital reserve. Now, almost nobody is reserving adequately for capital needs. That's why there's such a problem with deferred maintenance. We're going to talk a little bit in this presentation about how to start setting up a capital reserve and how to take some tiny steps that move you in the direction of what needs to be done. All this is getting us oriented in the direction that we need to go, and then giving us some ways of taking first steps in that direction. We're not going to get to the Emerald City tonight. Okay, so I think we come back to that in this report or in this presentation. If that wasn't sufficient, write more questions in the chat, and I'll try to address it again because it's a very important issue.
And Jerry, there's just another quick question up about doing accruals and using extra if you do have it in one year to the next.
Well,
I
suppose, to some extent, if it's kind of a small amount of money, $1,000, couple $1,000 that just has to do maybe with a little bit of cash flow or something. The trouble is, if you got a major gift in one year and you roll it over to the next year and put it in the budget, you're really just building in a problem for yourself a year or two down the road when you've spent that money. Then what are you going to do with the budget? That's why I think the annual budget needs to be generated really every year in its entirety from current sources, because if you're depending on reserves to fund your budget, you're going to spend them down. And then what are you going to do? So it's a good thing to keep the reserves and find another way to fund your annual budget. Okay. Now, back to the reports that you give the vestry. First of all, on both the income side and the expense side, don't just list all the categories alphabetically the way your Quicken or the accounting system that you have may want to do. Group like income and expense items together and come to subtotals. So individual contributions is plate, pledge, holy days, and any other special contributions that come from individuals toward the operating budget. Space use income is all of the people that use your building. Many of us have more than a number of people using the plant. On the expense side, put all personnel expenses together, plant operating expenses together, office expenses, work outside the congregation, which includes your diocesan assessment and any outreach that you do. So you group like things together and bring them to subtotals. And then you basically talk about the subtotals. You don't talk about each individual line. You only go to an individual line when there's a question about why it's doing particularly well or particularly badly. The report should not exceed 2 pages. If it exceeds 2 pages, it's a report for the Finance Committee, not for the vestry. It means that there's too many small numbers on the report, and that you want to have a useful discussion about the finances of the parish. If you pass out a 4-page report that lists what we're paying for the water cooler and what the every 12-step group is giving us every week, you're going to invite people to talk about the unimportant numbers, and you're going to distract the conversation from the things that the vestry ought to be dealing with. And you need to show these 4 columns. You need all 4 of these columns, and you don't need any more columns. I've got very strong views about this. You need year-to-date actual. You don't need the previous month. There's just too much 1 month is just not a useful thing once you get into the middle of the year, because quarterly bills come due, it's summer, pledges are down. I mean, there's so much cash flow issues in a month statement that that's all people end up talking about. So the first column is the year-to-date actual, because it answers the important question, how are we doing so far this year? And the second question is, where did we think we would be? How did we think we'd be doing at this point in the year? So you need the current year-to-date budget. So if this is the September report, you need the first 8 months of actual activity, and then you need your annual budget divided by 12 multiplied by 8. And then the third question is, how does that compare with last year? Are we up or down from last year? Are we doing better or worse? And if we're doing better, why? If we're doing worse, why? So you need the previous year's actual activity to date. So if we're looking forward to let's say the March Vestry meeting, you need January and February 2014, 2 months of the current budget, and January and February 2013. And then the final question is, what are our targets for this year? And so you need the total current year budget. If you leave out the year-to-date budget, you don't give people an easy way to see if where we are right now is where we thought we'd be. If you leave out the previous year's activity, you don't give people the information to answer the important question, how does this compare to last year? So you want a report that does not exceed 2 pages, that puts like income and expense items together and comes to subtotals, and that has these 4 columns. If you've ever said to yourself, or anybody's said to you, no, the vestry here doesn't understand anything about the finances, I'll bet if you give people reports in this format for 6 or 8 months, you'll be surprised at how much they can learn about the finances. So now, some indicators about healthy operating budgets. As I've said before, these are kind of diagnostic tools more than prescriptions, I think. That on the income side, individual contributions are paying for 75% or more of a healthy budget. If your budget is not healthy, if you know that the expense side is too low and you're trying to figure out how to rebuild the congregation and rebuild the budget, it's perfectly okay for the individual contribution number to be less than 75% while you're building resources, getting money into the budget to start turning things around. But once you get to a healthy, thriving place, you want to make sure that the bulk of your operating income is coming from the people, so that, because otherwise they're going to feel that somebody else's money is paying for this, usually it's the endowment, and are not going to be motivated to give, and are not going to think that it's theirs. They're not going to have a high enough psychological stake in what's going on. It'll just be, what they're doing with the parish, not what we're doing with the parish. So other sources of income, rentals and fundraising events, I would say in a healthy budget, they shouldn't exceed 25%. As you're building toward health, they may well exceed 25%. And I would recommend, I don't know how many of you use investments, resources from your investment in your operating budget, but I would encourage you to adopt the goal of weaning the operating budget off any reliance on using investments or endowments for your operating budget. First, there's a bunch of risks, both to the investments and to the parish morale and everything else, from using endowments to fund the operation, and instead direct the draw from your endowment to your capital reserve. It would be quite possible for a parish with a $2 million plant to have built up a $2 million well, you'd need about $1 million or a little more to allow you to fund a $50,000 a year capital reserve. That's how I think the capital reserve ought to be funded. So either start to redirect your investment income toward the capital reserve, or if you don't have an endowment, start one with your planned giving effort and tell people that it's going to be devoted, the principal's not going to be spent, and the income is going to be devoted to keeping the plant in good repair. There are 4 good reasons.
We do have a few particular questions, but I think you should continue on with where you're headed now, and we'll come back to some of those.
Okay, all right. I have 4 what I think are compelling reasons not to use investment income in your operations. First, people come to rely on that other people's money is paying for this. I don't have to pay for it. You know, Miss Jones continues to pay for it through her bequest. It also makes the leadership less accountable to the members because the vestry can draw on resources to do things that it wants to do that the parish may very well not really support. And so that's not good. That's not good. It's very good for the clergy and the vestry to be always completely accountable to the membership. I don't mean that they hold you hostage to things, but to be accountable and to say, well, I don't think we should use parish money for that because people really don't want that to happen, you know. And the third thing is that if you start to use endowment income in your operating budget, you will almost certainly begin to overspend it. I cannot think of a parish there is no parish I'm aware of that is either not overspending the endowment right now if they use it for the operating budget, or that has not overspent it in the past. And the reason that you overspend it is you get, if you're trying to be responsible about it and limit your draw to 4 or 5% of the total return, maybe you're doing that for a while, especially when the markets are up. And then when the markets turn down, your drawdown, actually a prudent drawdown, goes down some. But people don't want to make the budget cuts, and they will say, well, we'll just, for this year, because of the crisis, we'll continue to take what we were taking out last year, even though it's an imprudent amount. And we'll, you know, but once you start, you will almost never stop until the situation gets really dire. But the final thing is that once you're accustomed to taking what you need out of the endowment to plug the operating budget and to do capital improvements and stuff like that, people's thinking gets frozen. They cannot think about how they could do it any other way. And I tell people, especially when I sit with a vestry that's overspending its endowment, but says things like, well, we need to have a sexton, and there's no money to pay for it except the endowment, and we need to take care of the buildings, and there's no way to do it except for the endowment. I said, you know, you're about 4 or 5 years from figuring out how you'll do it in some other way, because by then the endowment will be gone. So it's a good idea not to get into that situation of dependence on the endowment. I like to say that overspending the endowment is the most addictive corporate behavior that there is. It's the institutional equivalent of smoking crack. It's very hard to stop once you start. On the expense side, a healthy budget is going to spend somewhere over half on personnel, clergy, lay, employees, salaries, and benefits. The cost of the building, including utilities, insurance, maintenance, and supplies, but not including the staff, should not, if it exceeds 25% of the budget, you're experiencing stress. Program, meaning everything else that isn't staff and building costs, Christian education, liturgical supplies, outreach, diocesan assessment, the office, which is an important part of the ministry and program, would also be like 20 to 25%. And that outside of the operating budget, you are funding a capital reserve. And then, well, in any budget, you need to be able to demonstrate to your membership the impact of what you're spending. In other words, this is a way of raising money when you're talking about the budget. You don't usually do a good job of increasing people's giving when you say the insurance bill has gone up and we need more money. You increase people's gifts when they understand, when they're able to make the connection between the dollars they give and the programs and ministries that the parish is able to do. So, for example, when public television does its fundraising, it doesn't really talk about its fixed costs that much. A little bit, but not very much. The main thing is your money funds this program. Your money funds that program. This is the program you're passionate about. Your money goes to this program. So the more we can demonstrate that what people are giving us goes toward what they want to see happen. And they want to see, it's not just outreach, they want to see a choir, they want to see a Sunday school program and a good Christian education program, and a lot of your fixed costs, especially about the building, are what allows you to have a Sunday school and an education program. Buildings are not the opposite of ministry. Buildings are what enable ministry.
Jerry, while we're at a pause there for just a half second, everyone who's out there, you're asking some really good questions, and we will try to answer all of them. We won't be able to answer all of them while we're online because we'll run out of time. But Jerry, just want to note a couple of quick thoughts when we're still talking about budgets and reports.
Right.
Do you have an opinion about which is better to do a quarterly budgeting tracking or a monthly one? Someone has just switched to quarterly from monthly and has found it useful. Do you have any opinion of that?
You mean you only give reports to the vestry once a quarter?
Yes. What's your opinion if you were to
Well,
switch to?
Well, I look, if the monthly report thing wasn't working, I mean, if it was just causing, endless vestry meetings, okay, try quarterly for a while, but think a little bit first, or think also, what kind of reports were people getting? What kind of information were they getting? I think if you give people information in both the grouping things together and those 4 columns, I think you can do a monthly report that is not going to take more than 10 minutes of the vestry meeting, and that people will feel that they're being adequately reported to, and they will understand the parish operation better. So I prefer monthly reports to the vestry on the operating budget, quarterly reports on the investments, no more than quarterly on the investments. It just makes people too anxious. But think about what wasn't working, why you switched from monthly to quarterly, and try this format if it differs significantly from the format that you're using, and see if you can go back to a monthly report that actually is useful and constructive and leads to a constructive discussion. Is that enough?
Thank you, Jerry. That's fine. Why don't you go ahead and do this next slide, and I will have a follow-up question from someone relating to some of this.
Okay, I've said a bunch of stuff that may have seemed a little bit overwhelming, and this may be a little more, this may be different from what you thought this was going to be. And so what I've said about what makes a healthy budget, and that it's probably much bigger than the budget that you have, and if you are using investments for your operating budget, and if you don't have a capital reserve, some of the things I'm talking about may have just seemed overwhelming. Just remember that every journey begins with a step. Leadership is just working year by year toward a goal. Sometimes you'll be able to take 2 steps forward. Sometimes it'll be 1 step forward. Sometimes it'll only be a lateral step, and sometimes you'll be thrown for a loss. But you keep your eye on the goal, and you work toward it. Any progress you make will make the parish healthier than what it was, and your successors will thank you.
Jerry, on a similar note, there has been a question about the challenge of them meeting their diocesan assessment. Goes by many different names, but it's the fair share allowance, all of those things. In this case, Robert has shared with us that they're using the endowment principle to pay that value. And this is a big topic, but do you have any wisdom to share regarding that issue?
This is a tough one, and certainly given my history, I was 13 years on the diocesan staff, spending most of that time justifying the diocesan assessment. So my recommendation is not going to be stiff the diocese, because I understand from the other side how it looks from there. However, your diocese also has an interest in your health. I always said that from the diocesan point of view, if it's not in the parish's long-term interest, it's not in the diocese's long-term interest, because if there aren't healthy parishes, there's no need for a diocesan office. So on the other hand, I've heard lots of complaints about parishes that, well, we're overspending the endowment because of the assessment. Well, you're overspending the endowment, period. That's what you're doing. The assessment, the assessment is part of what being an Episcopal church is. So I was with one vestry, and they were just in terrible shape. But at one point the rector said, "We can pay our bills, we just can't pay the pension and the assessment." And I'm like, huh? No, you can't pay your bills. Those are your bills. If we didn't have this expense, because that's basically taking you down a non-reality road. The reality is you have this expense, so it's part of your expenses. So it's part of figuring out how to ratchet down overdrawing your endowment, and the only way to do that is to start looking at your endowment as another limited stream of income. You know that every other kind of income that you've got it may go up in the future. There may be, people may give more in the future, but this year, that's all they're going to give. You may be able to get more money out of the nursery school, but this year, that's all the money you're going to get out of the nursery school. You have to think the same way about your endowment, that all we can take is this amount, and we have to make the budget work at that amount. So the first thing, do we get into this, Jim?
Well, I think
yes, we do.
You have about 16 minutes left, so you may want.
All right, we're going to do it.
Thank you. That those are important and wise words. So.
Okay, you control unrestricted and restricted funds. In other words, funds that people have just given you and funds that people have given you and said, I want you to do this with it. If you take a donor designated or restricted fund, if you accept it, then you have accepted the restriction and you are legally obligated to observe the restriction. If you take unrestricted money, you can do anything within the law that as long as you're using it for the parish purposes, the tax-exempt purposes. So you can take a bequest and you can treat it as an endowment. You can treat it as a vestry designated endowment fund and treat it as if it were money that somebody had told you, I'm giving you this $500,000. You cannot spend the $500,000, but you can spend the income. So if the vestry has put the designation on the funds, it's not permanent. The vestry can undo it, although I think that's generally a bad idea. If the donor has put the restriction on the funds, then you have to live with it. Now, if you're overspending your endowment, and so this is like for the parish, where you're taking more than you should out of the endowment, and you're attributing that to the assessment. Okay, you stop thinking about what you take out from the endowment in dollar terms, and you start thinking about it as a percentage of a 3-year average. So if you have $1 million, just to be, round numbers that are easy to deal with, you may have a budget deficit. Last year it was $80,000. This year it's 95. So you took 80,000 out last year. You're budgeted to take 95 out this year. It's what you need to plug the operating budget. Well, stop thinking of it as that and start thinking of it as what we're taking out of the endowment this year is 9.5% of its value. A sustainable level is 4.5 or 5. So you start thinking about the percentage of a 3-year average that you're taking out of the endowment, rather than we're just taking out what we need to balance the budget. That's step number 1, to start thinking in percentage terms. Step number 2 then is, okay, we've adopted this budget that says that we're taking out $95,000. We're going to see if there's any way that we can take out less, but next year we're going to calculate the average based on the new market values, and we're going to multiply it by 7.5 or 8%, and that's all that we're going to take out. We're going to make the 2015 budget work with that amount of money from the endowment, no matter what. The same way we'd make it work at some way if we only had pledge income to deal with, and this is all the pledge income that we were going to get, because you have to stop thinking of the endowment as the well from which you can always draw however much you need. You have to start thinking of it as just another limited stream of income. So next year it's 7.5. The year after that it's 7 or 6.5 to get it down to a sustainable level of no more than 5%. So if you're significantly overdrawing the endowment this year, it's going to be a multi-year process to get it down to a sustainable level, and it's not going to be easy, and some people aren't going to understand why they should even do that. We have the money, why don't we spend it? Well, I would like to think that there are going to be people sitting around this vestry table in 75 or 100 years, and I would like them not to remember us as the people spent the endowment down to zero. This is part of what remembering the future is about. This is our responsibility to the future, not to spend everything that we have on our needs, but to remember that there will be people who are coming after us. And so now this is to try to start unfreezing your thinking. Okay, if we get this much from pledges and this much from rentals and this much from fundraisers and this much from the endowment, and we need that much plus X, how are we going to raise X? How are we going to get X? Can we get it by doing a more intentional, better job with the pledge drive this year? Can we do it by finding a new tenant? Is the nursery school or the tenants that we have, are they really paying us what the thing is worth? Have we been thinking that having that program here is part of our outreach? Well, okay, well, maybe that outreach has been funded partly by overdrawing your endowment. Is that what you really want to do? Can you sustain that? Will people 50 or 60 years from now think that was a prudent use of the money? How else can we get some money in here? So this number 3 is what I hope starts to thaw people's thinking so that they can start to think in new directions about how to meet the challenges. Where would the money come from if you didn't have it? Because I do guarantee that if you continue to overspend the endowment, It's not going to be, maybe it'll be after your term on the vestry expires. Maybe, I've known some very cynical, well, they didn't come across as cynical, but the clergy that, one guy went to a parish when it had $3 million, and he timed it perfectly and retired when they were down to $85,000. He didn't steal any money. He just got the vestry to overspend it every year so that he didn't have to do any hard work about raising money. Another woman spent 2/3 of the endowment of a major parish in one diocese, and then was able to jump to another major parish that still had money to spend down. So you gotta, it may not happen while you're there, but if you continue to overspend the endowment, it will be spent down to zero or down to the point where it's not an endowment anymore. And then you will think about how to do this without the endowment. If you can think about how to do it without overspending the endowment, think how much better it would be to have the endowment still to fund your capital reserve. You're reserving money for capital needs. If you're not reserving money, it means you're borrowing from your building every year. You need a regular stream of income to fund your capital reserve. The goal is to set aside 2.5% of the replacement cost of your plant into a capital reserve. If you are not doing anything at all and you don't have an endowment, and the place to start is with your operating budget. Let's see. Okay. The place to start is with your operating budget. You need to, if you have a major repairs line in the operating budget, instead of keeping that in the operating account, set up a money market account or a savings account and transfer the money in there, and then make any major repairs from there. Next year, increase that line at least by some amount, at least by $500 or $1,000, and transfer it to the capital reserve. Maybe there's a fundraising event that you do where you can direct the proceeds of the fundraising event into your capital reserve account. If you have an endowment and you're using the endowment to support the operating budget, once you get your draw down to a sustainable level, then see if you can start putting part of that sustainable draw into the capital reserve account. The idea is to be putting money into a capital reserve account every year from somewhere while you're figuring out the long-term solution, which I think in most cases is to direct the drawdown from your endowment to the capital reserve. So for some people that means weaning the operating budget off its dependence on the endowment. For other people it means starting an endowment through a planned giving effort and using the proceeds, using the income, the drawdown from the endowment to fund the capital reserve.
Jerry, I know you have said in many instances when I've heard you, and I think this addresses some of the things that have been brought up in some of the questions,
right,
that the biggest problem with parishes trying to balance a budget more is on the side of income, coming up with new ways of raising income, because expenses are often things that can't be impacted because you do need to have a parish, you need a priest, you need all those other. Can you say something about that?
The long-term solution to any budget problem is always on the income side. There is no long-term solution on the expense side, meaning if your income continues to decline, the long-term solution is not continuing to cut the expense side. The only long-term sustainable solution is to increase the income side. Now, if your income side is working only because you are seriously overdrawing your endowment, then my rule needs a little epicycle or a sidebar that says for a couple of years, you may need to cut the expense side of your budget for the greater, longer-term purpose of getting your endowment spending under control. On the other hand, while you're the best way would be if you were able to think of how you could increase or develop a revenue source that would make up for the endowment draw that you won't be taking out. But people's thinking may be so frozen that they may not be able to do that right away. But they need to start cutting down the overspending of the endowment as soon as possible, because you're frittering away what should be one of your permanent assets, like your land. It's as if every time you overdraw the endowment, it's like you were selling a strip of your property. How long could you do that and be sustainable? That's the way to think of it. But in general, absolutely, the answer to a budget crisis is always on the income side.
Thank you, Jerry. If you could, we have just under 5 minutes. If we can wrap up with some of your other points and some concluding points.
Well, don't do payroll in-house. Check with your diocese or the church pension group. There's a cost-effective way to process your payroll professionally so that no volunteer has to be doing all those onerous quarterly reports and issuing the W-2s and the 1099s. Make sure that you're providing your lay and clerical employees with the pension and medical coverage that's required by the canon. Your diocesan administrator can help. And do please comply with the audit requirement of your diocese. Faithful leadership and faithful leadership means being transparent stewards of parish assets. And so don't skimp on the audit requirement. If you have to do a CPA audit, look at that as an astringent opportunity to be accountable and welcome it. I always had fun when the auditors were around because I knew where every nickel was.
Well, just to underline something you're bringing up there, Jerry, which I think is so crucially important in raising new funds from people, is being transparent and being clear to people on what you're using the funds for and showing that they are making a difference, both in the lives of the people in the parish as well as in the greater world.
We don't have time for me to go into my thoughts about how to run pledge drives, but just in general, we take our donors for granted. We don't say thank you. We assume they know things that we haven't told them. And we use usually ineffective fundraising techniques and then are disappointed with the results. And we also tell people that they have to, should, ought to. God is calling them to do stuff. And that language of obligation is extremely demotivating. All right.
You're fine. I'm just coming on early, but go ahead and do your next slide.
Is there a next slide? Oh, yes, the helpful resources. Yes, especially everything that ECF does that Jim has talked about. The Manual of Business Methods is a publication of the National Church, and you can download it from the Episcopal Church's website. Then, of course, I do think that my books, especially for lay leaders, especially the first book, Remember the Future, I would really recommend that to you. It's available as an ebook and from church publishing or Amazon, anybody. And then the Episcopal Network for Stewardship at tens.org is also a good resource for talking about how to talk to people about money.
Well, thanks, Jerry. And there's a note that has come up about how people can learn to run pledge drives. And I'm very happy to turn to the next slide, which shows all of our various webinars that we have recorded. The Episcopal Church Foundation, in its effort to serve Episcopal leaders across the country and empower you to do all of this work in raising financial resources, as well as leadership capacity. We have numerous webinars that are all recorded, just like this one will be, and you can go on our website at ECFVP for vitalpractices.org, and you can play any of these webinars. So please do know that there are tremendous resources that are available for you. I would really
also
like to go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, I mean, a full discussion of my ideas. It's not a program to run a pledge drive, but it's how to get your head in the right place to talk to people effectively about money is addressed in the